Hi everyone, you're listening to the Brown History Podcast. My name is Essen and this is episode 22. On today's episode, we discuss Indian mega corporation Tata with our guest Mircea Raianu. He is a historian who just recently released his book titled Tata, the global corporation that built Indian capitalism. Right from the book title, you can see that the Tata Corporation isn't just any corporation. This is a very fascinating episode. I can't wait till you guys hear it. Also, if you're enjoying the Brown History Podcast and you want to help out, you want to sustain it, you want to watch it grow, then consider being a Patreon. Just visit brownhistorypodcast.com. Anything you contribute, no matter how small, will go a long, long way. So now let's start this episode. Shall we begin? Here we go. So if you want to start, we can start.
Sure.
Yeah. All right. For people who don't know what the Tata Corporation is, could you explain what it is and why it's so important when you look at the history of capitalism in India?
Sure. So Tata is one of India's largest and most diversified corporate groups. It's been around since around the 1850s, so for about 150 plus years. And that kind of longevity alone, I think, is reason to focus on it and to study it. Very few conglomerates of this kind around the world have that kind of longevity. So there are lots of different comparisons that you could make between Tata and, for example, Samsung in Korea, or many groups in Latin America. So this is having a group that is large and diversified. So when I say diversified, I'm talking about everything from industry, steel, hydroelectric power generation, cars, to consumer products, retail products. They make the salt that goes on people's dinner tables. And also more recently, we're talking about information technology, consulting, and these kind of new service sector businesses. So it's not uncommon. So that kind of diversification, when I talk about it, it seems, they call it a salt to software, T to IT group. So when I talk about it, it seems pretty impressive, but it's not so uncommon around the world. Now, what is uncommon is that you couple that with this longevity, with the fact that they've been around for so long and also have survived through different political and economic transitions. So if you think about what the world was like when Tata got its start in the middle of the 19th century under the British Empire, then into the period of the rise of nationalism, and then into the early years of independent India, and then now in this kind of globalized and liberalized world economy, Tata has retained its position as one of India's leading groups. So for me, I think those two reasons, the size, the scale, the scope of the group, and the fact that it's been around for so long, you put those two together, I thought it would be a very important group to study. And I think it's for those reasons, I think also people who maybe are not aware of Tata should be interested in it a little bit more and get some, maybe think about it comparatively with some of the other cases that I mentioned, or even in the US and other places.
In the 150 years that it existed, I think it was passed down 3 times to various different family members.
Yeah.
Would you say, is there a common philosophy between the three that made it survive this long?
So it's an interesting question because if you just look at, if you open up the Wikipedia page and you look at the list of leaders or chairmen, right, you will see these three major figures, each kind of corresponding to a period of time, kind of what I was mentioning. So Jamshedpur Tata represents the beginning of the group in the colonial period. JRD Tata represents the phase of the group when it was consolidating and also dealing with the new Indian government. So this is the era of the transition independence and the time of a kind of mixed economy or quasi-socialist economy. And then Ratan Tata, the most recent long-serving chairman, represents the period post-91 of globalization and liberalization. And they're all Tatas and they're all related.
Yeah.
So you might think that Tata is actually this kind of perfect or idealized case study of a family-based business group, because you see the names of Tata. And actually the chairman now, Chandrasekharan, is the first non-Parsi chairman and one of only the second, I think, non-Tata chairman, or the third non-Tata chairman, but the first non-Parsi chairman in 150 years. But as I show in the book, actually, if you look at some of the other Indian business groups, the Birlas, the Ambanis, and even going back to the colonial period, all the other major business houses, whoever you want, Bajaj, Mahindra, and so on, the Tatas are actually quite non-family below that top level. So this is partly due to the fact that Parsis don't tend to have a lot of children. But it's also due to certain structural features of business in Bombay and business in the Parsi community that there is less of a tendency to pass on to children and less of a, which also leads to less of these kind of succession disputes. So the Ambanis did a classic case study where the father gives it to the sons divide the empire among them, and there's feuds and drama and all that kind of stuff. Same thing happened with Birla, which kind of broke up under different groups. So these are case studies that a lot of people use to think about the dynamics of family business. But actually, the Tatas don't really fit that model quite well. So I think that that's another reason why it was interesting for me to study it, because while it does represent certain features of Indian business pretty well, other features, including this family character, Tatas are a little bit of an outlier or an exception. But again, if you just look at the top leaders and their personalities are very sharply defined, and as I said, their role in particular historical moments is very well defined. But actually, if you go beneath them, you see a lot of different dynamics that don't necessarily revolve around family and don't even necessarily revolve around the Parsi community.
They have a very good nationalistic image, do good image, for India image. Now, I think right now the corporation makes more money from outside of India than it does from inside India. And number two, going back to pre-colonial times during the British rule, they have like a reputation of being very anti-imperialism. In reality, does that contradict to what's really happening?
Yeah, and I should say before I answer that, I'll say that that reputation is actually kind of, if you will, the third factor that makes Tata somewhat different, or makes it stand out. Certainly, a lot of groups do philanthropy. A lot of groups have good reputations, but Tata has kind of built up this really enormous cachet, mostly due to their philanthropy, the fact that they have these big trusts that have been operating for since the 1920s, 30s, and still own the majority stake in the business. And also because a lot of the industries that they pioneered, so the steel industry, for example, were industries that India needed to modernize and industrialize on that big scale. And the Tatas were kind of the first to enter into some of these new sectors. So they have this reputation, number one, of doing good, as you say, number two, of serving India, helping build India in a way that perhaps more than other groups.
Yeah.
But you're right, as I show in the book, they have been really involved in global markets and global trade from the start. I mean, they got their start in the cotton and opium trades. One major theme of the book, which I kind of didn't really expect to find when I started, is their connections with the US, which have been going on from the very beginning. So bringing in kind of American engineers, American technology for the steel plant. Then moving, also kind of modeling themselves, modeling those trusts, for example, on the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations. Then into the era of the Cold War, actually using a lot of American money and American connections to kind of get around the restrictions of the government. And then, after 91, definitely, as you say, Tata has a huge global footprint that in some ways is more important sometimes than their domestic footprint. So TCS, Tata Consultancy Services, is the company that kind of carries the group right now. It makes the most money. It's the moneymaker for the group.
That's the company where telemarketers call the US and pretend that they live in the States and they speak perfect English, but really they're in India.
That's right. That's right. And that's part of that new sector that has grown since the early 90s. But they also do more higher level consulting, as well as this more basic kind of bread and butter IT stuff. But, TCS is operating around the world. And you could say that a lot of the businesses that I was talking about, their more domestic Indian businesses don't always make a lot of money. And in some of those sectors, they've actually been burned pretty badly. So, for example, in telecoms, Tata had many failed starts and didn't really establish a footprint. And that's a huge market in India. So overall, I would say that that reputation of being kind of India first is definitely at odds with the actual history of the group. But as I show in the book, part of the point of trying to study it from the inside is to really look at how these things are kind of dynamic. So each generation of Tata management, and a lot of the kind of political figures that are commenting on Tata or involved with Tata are kind of debating this, right? So in the 1930s was a moment when those American connections actually became kind of a political problem for Tata. A lot of nationalist politicians from the Congress were saying, hey, why are you, inviting, for example, American capital to control the hydroelectric companies, which were started as this kind of nationalist enterprise, generating electricity for Indian mills in Bombay, owned by Indian princes. The capital is owned by Indian princes. And it started by by Jamshedpur Tata in India, and all of a sudden now they sell the kind of ownership stake to the Americans, and the politicians are like, what are you,
Yeah.
questioning the nationalist credentials.
Yes.
So I would say that part of the book traces that dynamic between the global and the national, but it's a very complex and shifting dynamic. So I'm not trying to say that like actually Tata is not nationalist, because they do a lot of things for India and within India, but nor am I trying to say that they're, one or the other.
But you question I wouldn't say you question it, but you would say that their charity work and their philanthropy and their contribution to social sciences is also kind of a hidden agenda, that they're making connections at the same time.
Yeah, I would say that maybe that's putting it a little bit strongly to say
Sorry,
it's a
yeah,
hidden
maybe I put it
agenda.
strongly.
But I do think that it is, I think in the tendency of like, if you were to read most books on Tata before mine, unless there's some kind of like hardcore anti-Tata book, which there are a few out there, or
Yeah.
like kind of journalism, criticizing them. But if you read most kind of mainstream pieces and mainstream scholarship and mainstream kind of journalism on Tata, there is this kind of assumption that everything they do is for kind of non-financial reasons, right? That like they built steel plants and cars and aviation, right? Which is another big sector that I didn't mention earlier that they entered into. We can talk more about that. Air India was started by the
I
Tatas.
want to ask about that after.
Yeah, we can talk about that. But, and people just assume that, oh, they're just doing this out of pure altruism, that they just want to help India. And it's the same with the philanthropy, that there's a theory, or not a theory, but there's a kind of understanding that the Tatas are totally different from any other business, that they operate on this kind of doing good principle that has no regard to profits and no regard to to economics fundamentally, even though it may be good also for the bottom line, but really they're motivated by something else. And in the worst, I would argue the worst type of argument that is made is actually kind of connecting it to kind of the Parsi community ideal, because it that falls into that reductive trap of saying that the only way that people can operate in India is on the basis of their religious or community norms, right? So because the motto of the Parsis is like good thoughts, good words, good deeds, that automatically means that Jamshedpur Tata is going to start a philanthropic trust, and I just don't think that's how the world works, like the way that all these things have a different calculation, right? So to go to what you're saying about philanthropy, so yeah, philanthropy is good in and of itself, for sure. It helps India because the Tatas were very conscious of doing things that would benefit India as a whole, and that is true. So they wouldn't donate all their money, for example, to Parsi fire temples or low-cost housing, as many other businessmen did. The Birlas, for example, did a lot more religious giving. So they very consciously were like, we're going to build hospitals and universities and things that are really they didn't even necessarily help their own city of Bombay that much. It was really kind of all India vision. But in the process, as I show in the book, they also get some benefits for their own businesses and for their own needs, like cultivating these connections with different experts that can help them out in their economic enterprises. And they also gain a lot of legitimacy, and they also gain some tax benefits
Yeah.
from this arrangement, and ways to kind of move around money and move around and make sure that they can control their companies using the trusts in such a decentralized and diversified conglomerate. So, the altruistic side, or like the side that is non-economically motivated, works alongside with some of the other motivations. So
Right.
it's not a hidden agenda, but it is definitely not as simple as just saying like Tatas are great because they were born like, more generous or better than other businessmen or other economic agents.
A lot of defenders of capitalism would argue that capitalism can be a force of good, and it can kind of dissolve and take down old barbaric traditions and customs that harm society or harm a certain group of people. And Tata Corporation is really dependent on its workforce. So I'm curious to know, when it came to the caste system, did they do anything with that? Did they kind of push it, or did they try to get rid of it?
That's a great question, and honestly one I don't get asked very often, and I wish I was asked more often about that. So like a lot of people who pick up the book might be surprised to find out that 2 of the 6 chapters are about the steel town of Jamshedpur, which is a town in Eastern India that they built from nothing basically for their steel industry. And it was also a town in which the Tatas were the major employer. They were also the major landowner, and they were also the municipal government. So if you want a place that really shows you in our modern day and age what a kind of mini society ruled by capitalists would be like, it's Jamshedpur, right? And there's good and bad that comes with that. And so right now I'm working on an article that is building on the themes of the book that explores the role of caste and religion in Jamshedpur. And it's very interesting because, again, there's no kind of clear-cut answer. So on the one hand, what you will see is some pretty striking statements, including by J.R.D. Tata, the chairman, that make it, and Jamshedji, the founder, who came before him, some pretty striking statements that really do show you that their intention was to create a cosmopolitan and diverse city that really brought Indians from all parts of the subcontinent together and did not discriminate and did not show favoritism. So there are many instances, revealing instances in the archives. For example, J.R.D. Tata is asked sometime in the 1930s to become the president of the local Parsi association in Jamshedpur. And he refuses, and he says, as the chairman, I cannot be associated with one community over another, even if it's my own community. Even though I'm obviously a Parsi and I'm obviously, care about this community, but I can't be associated with it. And you see this all throughout Jamshedji's instructions to build different places of worship for Hindus, Muslims, and Christians all throughout Jamshedpur are, a pretty clear example that even compared to other industrial cities in India that came after, Jamshedpur is a place that there's a lot of mixing, and it's very clearly there's this kind of cosmopolitan ethos there. On the other hand, you can't deny that in the way they structure their workforce and in the way that the residential and urban planning and the way the residential quarters were allocated, there's a very strong element of communal religious segregation and caste segregation in terms of the lower levels of jobs in the plant and in the mine. So sweepers, cleaners, these kinds of people go to the Dalits, and different jobs go to different communities, and that's, in that sense, Tatas are no different from other Indian employers. And sometimes, as in the case of the 1945 plan by Otto Königsberg, he's this German expert who comes in. He's this kind of very innovative, very interesting kind of modernist architect and planner. And he's hired by the Tatas. Again, that shows you their progressive intentions, that they're like, we're going to hire the best urban planners to make this into a livable and modern town. And you can see in that document, which I discuss in chapter 5 of the book, he's really kind of like, well, I would love to plan these neighborhood units, these kind of subdivisions of Jamshedpur in a way that people of different castes and classes can live in them, right? So you can have, for example, a clerk or a mechanic's house next to, maybe like a manager's house, and maybe next to like somebody who's an unskilled worker in the sanitation department, or something like that. But that event, but that's like basically a non-starter. And he's like, as much as I want to change this, I can't. And it's not necessarily clear whether it's the company pressuring him to do it, or whether he's just kind of being realistic as he looks around and he's like, yeah, this isn't going to work, right? And so we have to fall back on this kind of segregation and division that is so common in Indian cities. So I think that, again, even with that, you could say that up to a point, the Tatas do a lot to break down those lines of division in Indian society. But that stops only up to a point. And if you go to Jamshedpur today, it's still a pretty segregated and divided and unequal city under the control of the Tatas.
You think they did that because they wanted to avoid workers' rights and protests and things, anything that would, prevent production from continuing on?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. And I think there's definitely a sense that there's always a defense in all the literature, the archival material, and their writings of the management and of the leadership of Tata. There's always a kind of defensive feeling that this is just how things are, right? And as much as we may want to change them, or as much as we don't like it, this is just kind of how business is done, and it is kind of how labor is organized in India. And so we better not rock the boat. So I think there's that. So you have all these waves of experts, not just Königsberger, but people all the way back to the 1920s, British social scientists, Indian social scientists coming to Jamshedpur being like, this is how, you can organize your town better. You should create this, this, and that. And they're like, yeah, sounds great, but we just can't do that, right? Because that's just the way things are. So, and part of that is to buy industrial peace. But also, I would say is that there is also a kind of interesting reluctance on behalf of a private employer and a capitalist to actually govern people's lives too closely. And that's one of the things that I want to explore a little bit more in my research moving forward is, there's a kind of an assumption, I think, that, for example, if we turn our cities into private gated communities, or, there's a lot of literature about this now, a lot of concern about the privatization of urban space. You have in India places like Gurgaon where you have, or Gurugram as it is now, but I still call it that, but where you have private delivery of municipal services, water, electricity, sewage, that kind of stuff. And there's obvious problems with that, but there's always this, if you read some of the criticism of that, there's always this assumption that that private capitalists just want to control us and want to control all of our behavior, like kind of all the time, kind of like a totalitarian state, right? But that is, I guess, true up to a certain point. But there's also a kind of limit to that. And you can see, especially when communal violence comes to Jamshedpur, and the city suffers several episodes of rioting in 1964 and 1979, but even beforehand in the 1930s and 40s, there's a lot of ethnic tensions in the lead up to partition and all that. And you see that that the company is really reluctant to get involved and reluctant to really show favoritism and really do what kind of a government is supposed to do, which is to adjudicate, right? So you have all these people coming to them as the town government being like, hey, these Muslims have built a mosque on a plot that they're not supposed to, or the Hindus are being discriminated in the bazaar by the Muslim, and then the Muslims are complaining that the Hindus are organizing mobs against them and all that kind of stuff. And there is this really strong aversion to get involved and to try and maintain this kind of neutrality. And ultimately, that's also for the reasons that you mentioned. It's to make their primary objective is to make sure the plant is running and producing steel and making money. But at the same time, in order to do that, they have to be they have to control the town. If they have to control the town, they have to take on, as I say in the book, the functions of a sovereign or the function of a government that has to adjudicate people's claims. If you set up your own city of 1 million people, people are going to be coming to you with all sorts of problems and complaints that they want resolved. And to what extent do you as a private employer want to get involved in that? And I think if you talk to Tata people, even they will admit that that's been a struggle. And it's been a struggle to kind of determine how much responsibility you want to take for a particular community and its operations.
Let's talk about Air India. So
Yeah.
once upon a time, Tata opened up an airline called Air India, and it was doing pretty well, I think. I know they bought a lot of artwork, and they were really big on art. They even got Salvador Dali to get some ashtrays from him. So, and I look at the posters, the old vintage posters, and that they're so kind of like beautifully made, and there was like a certain kind of pride in it, But then something happens with Nehru, so I'll let you elaborate on that.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I don't really write about this in the book because it's been covered elsewhere, but Air India is really JRD Tata's baby. So he was a pilot. As somebody with a fear of flying, I've been afraid of flying for some years now. Reading some of those stories of JRD Tata flying this, little, twin engine plane in the 1930s through the monsoons, across India. Initially was delivering mail, so it started as a mail service, then expanded to a passenger service, mostly on the west coast of India. So that in the east coast there are other people, and he was really somebody who grew up with a love of flying. He grew up in France, and near his house there in Normandy, there was this aviator called Blériot. He was a famous French aviator, and so he kind of built this business out of his passion. And he he was kind of obsessive, OCD really, about all the details of service on the flights. So the flight attendants' uniforms and the timings of the meals and the state of the curtains and all that. So so there's that aspect of it. There's the more boring economic story, which is that obviously aviation in India was a growing sector, so it was a new market into which a lot of people poured into. And the Tatas were some of the leaders of that, but there were also other people that were maybe not as financially sustainable, maybe not as skilled, maybe not as careful to manage their new airline businesses, maybe didn't have enough resources to buy planes and maintain the planes. So by the end of World War II, by the mid to late 40s, you had a huge glut of companies, many of whom were kind of unprofitable and failing. And even the Birlas, this is an episode I discussed in the book, that the Birlas came in kind of latecomers, and the Birlas were the Tata's great rivals. And JRD was like, what are you doing? Like, if you come into this sector, you are just going to add to the super crowded market. And we need to kind of consolidate rather than continue to compete. Because eventually, if all our companies start to fail, because we're all trying to run, too many routes on, and not making enough money, the government will take us over, right? Because aviation was considered an essential industry. Mm-hmm. And that's not, I should say, dissimilar from other countries around the world. So if you think about all the great state airlines in Europe, for example, in this period, so British Airways is a nationalized airline, Air France, and so on and so forth. It's quite natural for India to move in that direction, but JRD wants to keep this industry in private hands, and he tells Birla, "Hey, don't come in, don't come into this turf, do something else." And Birla says, "Who are you to tell me, not to come in? You're a monopolist. You want to be a monopolist. You want to be the only game in town." And the consequences, they kind of both lose. And in 1953, the government decides to nationalize Air India. And they say I would say that it's pretty clear that there were solid economic reasons to at least consolidate that sector. And it made sense for it to be run by the government at the time. However, what ends up happening then is they keep JRD. So they invite him to kind of continue to sort of run the airline and give his input, especially the international Air India International, that side of it. But then there's a kind of second blow in the late 70s when they remove him completely from that company. And I don't know much about the history of it beyond that, but I think you definitely saw a kind of decline in the quality and service of Air India. But also there are economic pressures that make sure that these kind of state airlines aren't very competitive in today's market. The airline business is a super, super tough business. Which makes it, I think, a little bit strange that the Tatas have chosen to kind of go back into it now. And some people say that's for sentimental reasons because they want to kind of right the wrong that's been done to them. So they got back in, and now they have this airline called Vistara, which is I think it was a partnership with Singapore Airlines. And especially now post-COVID, I don't know how sustainable that sector is, or that kind of line of that business is going to be. But the Tatas seem to be kind of really attached to it, I think, for these historical reasons.
It could be kind of like a redemption, kind of like revenge. Like I could have done a better job.
Yeah, totally. And there's always discussions and rumors that they're going to buy Air India, right? Which would be like the ultimate.
Yeah.
Coming full circle. Yeah. And these kind of narratives, you see them with Tata all, even when they bought Chorus, which was formerly the nationalized British Steel in 2007, they paid a lot of money for it, and it was right before the financial crisis. So it actually turned out they didn't know that, but it was 2007, so pretty bad time to go into huge debt over an industrial subsidiary or business. But they did it, and they got a lot of great press because it was seen again as this kind of revenge of India. Of coming back to the motherland that had colonized them and taking over. There was an article in the New York Times that I quote in the book. It literally was called "The Empire Strikes Back." Right? It was, but at the end, that turned out to be a very problematic investment that kind of dragged them down for the next decade of the 2010s. And so you see this again, these kind of tensions within the group, which I think are very interesting to study, between people who say the value, the symbolic value and the prestige value and the fact that it makes us global in this way is worth, even though it may not be like the most profitable or make the most financial sense, it's still good to do. And it was Ratan Tata, who really pushed for this. And then some of the people that came after him were like, maybe we should sell this off or cut this down. And there was a lot of infighting over that decision. But yeah, I think that narrative, the allure of that narrative that you're mentioning, that's always there. And I think Tatas are a group that are very conscious of history. And that's part of why I like studying them, because if you're a historian, you always have stuff to talk about with people from Tata because they're very conscious of and aware of their history. But some people would ask, are they maybe a little too fixated on the past and too fixated on their traditions and their history? And maybe that's hampering them from moving forward sometimes and kind of cutting their losses. But we'll see what happens with the airline. It's very hard to predict, obviously.
I think it was in the 90s when corporations from outside of India started coming in and investing, and they had the right to do that, and then which means that the competition would significantly increase for the Tatas. How did they survive that?
It's interesting because one of the ways in which they did that was to try and make a move into markets that would grow domestically. So I think the auto business was one of them. Now, that didn't end up doing very well, I think, in the long run, but at least it gave them a kind of building the Indica, building a cheap car for the Indian middle classes, and then the Nano was a huge disaster. But I think there was a kind of confusing, there was a confusing goal that they were trying to have, between like a cheap car versus a kind of convenient car that could also meet some of the aspirations. I think that's what people are saying now was kind of the problem, is that no aspirational middle class Indian family wants to be like, oh, I'm driving the world's cheapest car. It's basically a rickshaw with metal plates around. And it wasn't a very safe car either, right? So and on Indian roads, you want a pretty safe vehicle, right? But it's very hard generally for example, foreign car manufacturers to really take hold in a market like India, because it just wasn't, it couldn't sustain, I think, the level of imports that we had. So they operate in there. TCS was the kind of reverse of that, because it was really doing something where India was competitive on the global market, so they could actually sustain themselves on that basis. And now it's the biggest moneymaker in the group, as I said. And then in steel, they actually had some huge cost advantages throughout the 90s and 2000s, and that was their very cheap ore from captive mines, which is an advantage that they lost when they bought Chorus, because all of a sudden they had to compete for ore in open global markets. So if the price of ore goes up, say in Canada, they take a hit, right? Whereas for the plant in India, they could transport their ore from the nearby mines in Bihar and Jharkhand and Orissa, right? So if you look at steel industry, for example, even with what I said, these advantages, they had to cut basically half their workforce, half their permanent workforce. In the early 90s. There was massive layoffs. And as I said, in things like retail and telecom, the Tatas have nowhere near like the kind of position that you would expect them to have. They have not made a lot of advances. They're trying, but those are also the kind of sectors where foreign businesses can come in and compete, right? So retail is like an especially problematic area, because you always have like Amazon and Walmart and like all these other multinationals kind of coming in. And then with telecoms, you have other players that have come in, and also Tata's tried to deal with the Japanese, do a joint venture with Japanese, and really work. And so there are some sectors in which Tata has faced a lot of challenges. And unlike, for example, say Samsung, to give another example of a conglomerate, they don't do a lot of this like manufacturing of kind of electronics and consumer goods. That's the Korean model of development, and also the Japanese model and the Chinese model is based on a lot of intensive skilled manufacturing of like consumer goods, and Tatas are not really in that space. So they were never at risk, but never really could compete in those spaces either.
Then in the 2000s, they started just buying companies like nonstop hardcore, right?
There was Chorus, there was Jaguar Land Rover, which and what's the other one? The T. Tetley Tea.
Tetley Tea. That's right.
Tetley Tea, right. And these are symbolic brands, pretty iconic, kind of British brands also. Tetley Tea is like something that you can say every British cupboard has a Tata product in it. And JLR was like a huge coup. And I think that it was, the company wasn't doing well at the time. And there was, I think Ford was trying to buy it. And I'm not really sure what happened there. So I didn't research this closely, but the Tatas came in with a better offer. And actually JLR turned out to be a pretty good investment. Because they had access to the Chinese market. So as China was growing a lot faster, not necessarily faster, but certainly there were more people in China who could afford luxury cars than in India, for example, or in other places. And that's kind of what sustained JLR in those markets. So I would say their strategy was to hang on to what they did well at home and kind of strategically get into some stuff that looked promising on a more global level. And some of those gambles paid off and some of them didn't. And so that's kind of the story of the group. And so over the past 20 years, so like some people are saying that maybe they're kind of past it, or maybe there's some things that can be cut or trimmed down, and some people say no, they got to keep kind of pushing on. So that's been kind of the main debate for the past decade.
My last question would be, did anything surprise you when you were researching the Tata Corporation?
I mean, I would say it wasn't a total surprise, but like, again, I think people might be surprised when they read the book to see, or at least I hope they will be. I hope what people will find if they read the book is that it's not really a kind of traditional business history, right? So there are chapters and you mentioned art collecting earlier. There's a
Yeah.
whole section about art collecting and photography and advertising, and there's a section about nuclear physics. There's a section about urban planning. There's a lot of political stuff. There are these strange connections I discussed in the last chapter with these Indian political figures like J.P. Narayan, who is this Gandhian, first a socialist and a Gandhian kind of politician and activist in India. And I think very few people know that he had this very close relationship with business and with the Tatas in particular for about 15 years in the 60s and early 70s, they're both trying to fight back or get around the kind of statist Nehru's kind of, and the Congress and Indira Gandhi's very state-driven agenda, right? So I did know that I would find all these connections and all these strange kind of angles and ways in which the Tatas were involved in some of, in some of India's political events, or in the realm of the arts or in the realm of the sciences. So again, through their philanthropy, their role in physics, in medicine, the cancer hospital, in the topic of great relevance today during the plague outbreaks of the 1890s, the Jamshedpur Tata was really promoting the vaccine, the anti-plague vaccine that was developed by this Russian bacteriologist named Hafkin. And so there's an interesting echoes there with our present day of like
Yeah.
private businesses trying to figure out what's the best way for us to get our operations running when all our workers are fleeing because of this outbreak of disease and because the kind of lockdowns of the British Empire the British authorities were imposing on Bombay. So vaccination was kind of one way to get out of that. And it was kind of this faith in science, or this reliance on science to get out of this kind of political economic problem. Same with JRD and family planning. That's the same story. JRD was kind of obsessed with population control and science-based family planning. Some of that took some dark turns, but it was again based on that kind of same principle of a scientific approach. So I guess what I'm saying to sum up is like that, when you start researching the Tatas, you end up in a lot of random places. You end up drawing a lot of connections between things that you didn't think were connected before.
Yeah.
And that's not 100% surprise, but I think the extent to which that ended up playing out and the extent of the stuff I was able to find that could build out this larger picture was at times pretty surprising. And I hope that, people look at the book and they might think that it's a kind of story of, just of business or entrepreneurship or of some of the stuff that we've talked about here of business strategies and things like that. But I want it to be read also as a broader social and cultural history, which I think the archive allows you to do.
Yeah. Modi is a very controversial figure right now, and there's a lot happening in India in the last few years. What is the relationship between Modi and Tata?
So I think the relationship between Modi and Tata, they got close in the late 2000s after there was this incident where the Tatas wanted to build a nano car factory in Bengal, and there were a lot of farmer protests, and the government in Bengal kind of pulled the offer of the land, and then Modi, who was then chief minister of Gujarat, came in and offered the land at a very cheap rate and other perks that allowed them to build the nano car there. And Ratan Tata, who was the chairman at the time, was pretty enthusiastic about this. And he said, Modi's a great person to do business with. And it was, even though the Tatas were also close to the Congress at the time, it was very clear that they had kind of backed Modi or given him a praise or an endorsement for the way that helped them do business. So that I think was, and that was again another, we were talking about narratives before, and that was another narrative of the Tatas coming home to Gujarat, right? And that Modi had helped them come home to Gujarat with their big kind of statement car project, which ended up not working out, but it was at the time, again, symbolically an interesting moment. Now, since Modi has come to power in 2014, what you see is that Modi has developed very close relationships with different businessmen, particularly the Adanis, who are from Gujarat. And there's a kind of mutual benefit there in terms of the support that Adanis give to Modi, and then the way they're kind of involved in a lot of infrastructure projects. And the Tatas are not really that close to Modi in that sense. So they're not as close to him as, say, the Adanis are. But at the same time, they have also not been as openly critical of Modi as some other business leaders have been. Now, in general, the relationship today between Modi and the business community has been strained a little bit over the past few years. There's been some tension between businessmen and the government. There's a lot of feelings that kind of the reforms that needed to be made to the economy have been kind of frustrated. But so I would say that by and large, Tata has, it's clearly they have expressed some support or some praise of Modi, but they haven't been totally in his not totally identified with him so closely. And if you look at it historically, this is kind of the way business in India operates. Is since the Nehru period, there have always been business groups that are close to the powerful. So Birlas were close to Nehru. Reliance, so Mukesh Ambani was very close to Indira Gandhi, and now there are groups that are close to Modi. And I think an interesting constant throughout this period is that Tatas have never really been 100% in the favor of the government. They have always been sometimes supportive, sometimes oppositional, but they've never really had the kind of access and the kind of access to the halls of power in New Delhi that other groups have had. But at the same time, it must also be said that just as sometimes during the Nehru period and sometimes during the Indira Gandhi period, during the emergency, they have expressed support for the government, sometimes very strong support when economic needs or economic growth was at stake. So in the last chapter of my book, I talk about this, that it was a state business alliance for growth was kind of the project that the Tatas were behind, but they weren't always as close, as I said, as some of these other groups.
All right,
All
man.
right, cool.
This is
Fun
great.
talking to you. Yeah.
So I'm going to send you ones ASAP.
I'll do that for sure.
All right. Awesome, man. Take care.
Cool. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.